I'd like to invite Vinod Khosla to the stage. Welcome, Vinod Khosla.
Thanks.
So this is the third time that we've had this conversation in this room on this stage, and I'm really, truly delighted to have you back, so thank you.
Happy to repeat the same stuff every year.
Actually, you repeat different things every year. Vinod is very interested in taking questions from the audience, so I think that we have a list of topics that we'd like to discuss, but feel free to interrupt us at any point and ask a question, and Vinod is happy to answer. So I'd like to begin by saying you are a technology optimist. What are you most optimistic about, and what has disappointed you?
Well, specifically in the domain of biology, research, healthcare, there's a very large number of point innovations happening. Mm-hmm. And I think the combinatorial of that is going to be explosive. It's sort of almost like there's so many chemicals in this broth, almost every possible reaction is catalyzed by something else in it, and the mixture gets almost autocatalytic if people understand sort of the phenomena I'm trying to explain. What makes me really optimistic is I suspect in the next 20 years we'll make more progress than we've made in the last 100 years. So if you want to imagine what 2040 might be like, you really have to look at 1920 or the year 1900. That's sort of the magnitude of the change that we're going to see. So it's very hard to imagine. You know, my kids find it hard to imagine. Not only didn't we have cell phones 20, 30 years ago, I didn't even have a phone at home when we were growing up. So I think we'll see progress that will surprise us. The thing to do is, I always caution people, it's very hard to predict the exact path. And so I always say I can speculate on what's possible, but not predict anything, if you know the difference. It's because of the large degree of uncertainty. One innovation over there, there's this, just hearing this talk on aptamers, there's a company in Colorado designing 5,000 different aptamers. Suddenly the way you do blood tests would change dramatically. So we can go into the specifics of any of these, but the change could be, that would enable so many differences, including the way we practice primary care medicine. And I can give you a few examples if you're interested, but these paths are unpredictable, but they're surely explosive. And I don't think there's any possibility, modulo time, that this won't happen. It was probably, in fact, it was exactly 8 years ago, I first wrote, 7.5, 8 years ago, I wrote a blog called Do We Need Doctors? Hugely controversial, hugely controversial. Then over the last 5 years, 4 years, I've seen the most skeptical of people admit to, well, okay, we won't need radiologists. Oh, okay, we won't need oncologists. Oh, okay, maybe psychiatry can be done much more precisely with machines than with human psychiatrists. One by one, these dominoes are falling. I'm almost certain this will happen. The fundamental notion of humans having the most expertise in an area, I think, will be challenged in every domain, which is sort of startling to people.
So I'd like to...
But this is why I'm an optimist.
I'd like to quote something very optimistic that you wrote in a recent paper about AI in healthcare. You asked, Is it likely that technology could multiply doctors, including many, if not most, specialties many-fold? Perhaps it could even invent a better doctor, making them always available everywhere, accessible and affordable or near free, like Google search. You then went on to describe the current reality, which is excellent care for few, improving care for more, and little to no care for those in the developing world. Could you please elaborate on what it will take to dramatically improve healthcare through AI?
Well, first, it takes spending time trying to do it. You know, we've long known that electric cars would be great. And you asked, and I'll give you the funniest statistic. In 2010, the Department of Energy made this 25-year forecast on the number of electric cars in the US. And what did they do? Went and asked the experts. They asked GM, Volkswagen, BMW. The predicted number in 2035 was exceeded by Tesla alone in 2016. Think about this. The world's best experts predict wrong by 20 years in a 25-year forecast.
Is that surprising?
It's not surprising, but here's the point I want to make. All this I'm describing is possible, but that doesn't mean it'll happen. When somebody comes along like Elon Musk and says, I'm going to make electric cars happen, and through sheer willpower, wills it. And he almost went bankrupt twice trying to do it. Then things happen. So I like to say, if you have people driving to do the right thing, and they don't get unlucky and fail, which happens often, then there's a chance something will happen. So let me give you a specific set of examples. Right? My son started a company. Very simple idea. He says, I want to reduce 24/7 over text messaging primary care to the cost of a Netflix subscription. Right? It's an AI system. It's the only way to do it. Now, you can't go there step one, day one. But if you sort of say over 5 years, you want to develop this system, what they're doing is running a service over text messaging where real doctors interact with real patients. Over time, the AI is doing more of the questions and answers. What's the next best question to ask this patient? What's the next best diagnosis? What are the possibilities? How do you narrow the... So it takes somebody to try to attempt to do this. A number of people are trying it in psychiatry. Sometimes narrow domains of psychiatry like CBT, behavioral therapy. Others are trying small, narrow slices of cardiology. If somebody wants to do it on oncology, it's so much easier to do it on oncology than in primary care. Somebody should be doing it. And the reality is there's plenty of romantics who talk about sort of humans doing it better. The real fact remains that most people who get cancer don't get to see an oncologist, definitely don't get to see a virtual tumor board. And everybody should have their virtual tumor board, and the only way to make it broadly accessible is through technology. And we'll probably need 10 good attempts for one to really work. So just because one failed, and MySpace failed before Facebook succeeded. Many people attempted social before Facebook came along. So we just have to have multiple attempts at it, enough of it to make technology dramatically cheaper, better. I fundamentally believe medical care will have to, for costs to drop by a large amount, it has to be automated. And the only way you get high quality is if you have very low cost, because all because of technology, not by humans.
Would anyone in the audience like to ask a question? Yes. Do you want to come to the microphone so we can all hear you?
Or I can repeat the question if you yell it loud enough.
So building on top of Lisa's question in AI and the medical space, when you guys evaluate new companies, there's so many. The promise is so big and the story is great for lots of them. What is it that you look in companies that separate them from the rest and make
So the question is, what do we look for in companies because there's so many of them? Let me add one more thought to my previous question. What I've said before doesn't mean that we don't need the human element of care, right? We know when an old age person moves into a nursing home or an old age facility, mortality increases by 50 to 60%. Clearly, there's an element of leaving your own home, going into a supported community with better care and higher mortality, right? So there is a human element that's very important. I'm not trying to minimize that. We also know the placebo effect works. So it's, and some would argue there's science behind the placebo effect. There's some pretty interesting phenomena there. My point is, I'm not saying that part isn't important, but the expertise part shouldn't be highly variable and shouldn't be, I can afford a doctor, Stanford, others can't afford that. They shouldn't get different quality of care. Having said that, what do we look for? People who just have the passion to drive a vision. Okay? In these domains, the stuff we are talking about today, deep expertise is needed. Now, when you're developing a new sensor, a new field effect transistor, or a new blood pressure sensor, non-invasive, or pick your favorite, there are many, many attempts that fail before one succeeds. We just have to recognize that nobody has the foresight to predict these. You just take high probability shots on goal. I don't know how many are hockey fans, but on average, you got to take 10 shots on goal to get one goal to score. And luck plays a large part, and then somebody develops something over in left field that you can use to improve your signal to noise or something else. So there's sort of this, what makes me optimistic, to go back to your question, is the number of people with passion and expertise who want to drive this, and the number of investors who are willing to take the large risk of, don't be scared if it might not work. There's people, investors, traditional investors look at what might not work and why things may fail. I always say, I look for what might work. I don't mind a 90% probability of failure if there's a 10% chance of changing the world. Right? And those are different philosophies. So that's what we look for. And that's what we see repeatedly. Sorry.
Oh, another question?
Do you mind comparing your confidence and your speculation in this space versus, let's say, internet space or previous patterns in the past? Hardware?
Here's, let me speak to causality a little bit, right? It's much easier to predict that something might happen than something will happen. And that's what, here's what I mean by that. Let's look at the healthcare space. Beautiful talk by Neurosteer, pretty stunning. You've heard a lot of these talks. There's 2 or 3 very important things going on. The sensor explosion, the measurement explosion, is going on. And it's mostly by discarding the Quest view of the world on the lab test and saying, we'll test a lot more, have a lot more data, even if we don't know what's valuable. Right? Because these sensors are making measurement easier, and Tom Insel, who used to be head of the psychiatry at NIH, now saying there's thousands of biomarkers in your cell phone and other devices that are way more predictive than what a psychiatrist may come up with. So these sensors are exploding, which then feeds the AI engines, the data analysis engines, the statistical engines. I would venture to guess, and I had this conversation with the CEO of Stanford Hospital about 4 or 5 years ago when they were designing the current new $1 billion investment new hospital. And we had a conversation. I said, you probably, they brought the whole IDEO design team to talk about this. And my conclusion at the end was, you're off by a factor of 1,000 in how much data you will have per patient, a factor of 1,000. We talked about 2 years ago, and I said, I was wrong by a factor of 1,000, but the other way. You'll have 1,000,000 times more data, not 1,000 times more data. Let me give you an example. We have a small company that does biomarker measurement. They made it cost-effective to do the following thing. They take a laser printer-like device, wheel into a primary care office. Every patient who comes in, they test them for almost everything you could measure, sort of on a Quest test. They don't charge for it. When a doctor specifies what test he wants to run, they deliver it at the price of that test. Guess what? They can still make money by testing everything if on the chance the doctor might want to measure one thing. So there's data generation going on at an unprecedented scale. We have another company that's hoping to do all proteomics and all metabolomics for under $100. Thousands of biomarkers per dried blood spot. Why are they picking dried blood spot? Because you can throw it in the mail for $5, and FedEx is too expensive when you get to those price points. This kind of data generation with the kinds of reports you read about from Google, that's where stunning nonlinear stuff happens. I could give you a lot more examples. My favorite example, for those of you who want to look at it, is protein structure prediction, what DeepMind did. Exceeded, for people who had never worked in protein structure prediction, exceeded the best research all over the world in this competition around protein structure. This just happened in December. Quantitative jump in performance in structure prediction accuracy. That's the AI part. There's the data generation part. They're feeding on each other. I suspect in 20 years, no part of today's medicine will exist, or very few parts, I should be more accurate. My personal belief is the notion of symptoms to diagnose disease will be obsolete. They're too coarse. I have a pain on my left side. Well, there'll be a biomarker for that. And I loved Ann's talk about which, in fact, this is a great example, which patient will respond to an SSRI or not. Extremely valuable.
Extremely valuable.
Extremely valuable. But let me give you a more stunning example. Humira, $14 billion drug, probably 7 to 10 billion of it is wasted because the patients don't respond. But everybody gets it because you can't tell. This is like 50 grand a year worth of drug, and it's a lifetime subscription. If you could tell what works and what doesn't, you'd save a lot of that cost. Bad for the drug company, good for the insurance companies. We have a company called Cypher in Boston. Using network science, not biology, they can predict which patient with relatively high sensitivity and specificity, which patient will respond or not. Network science, not biology. So those are examples of large-scale data resulting in surprising results. Sorry.
So when we provide personal data to a company in return for a service, we deserve and expect full privacy protection, and we want to provide as little data as possible. When we go to the doctor, we want to provide all the data for better informed medical decisions. How do you see that dichotomy when the doctor is a robot belonging to a company?
Well, I don't see a dichotomy. Let me suggest the following. The problem with data has not been data sharing. The problem has been lack of transparency. When you enter into a contract with Facebook to get free services in exchange for your data so they can use that data to sell you more stuff, if it had been very explicitly stated, and if they'd been very transparent about what is allowed and what's not, it'd be a fair contract. The fact that they didn't disclose or didn't even know what some of the people were doing with it is what the problem is. So let me propose a different alternative. I'm a patient. I get to choose how much of my data is shared and for what purposes. That's a pretty good contract. Now, the flip side of the contract from this theoretical company is if you share X amount of data, you will get the benefits of all the people sharing X amount of data. Let's say there's another cohort of people that will share a lot more data to get the benefits of everybody's pool. I'd sign up to maximize sharing of my data so I can get the best advice based on the most data. And other people who want to preserve privacy have absolutely the choice very explicitly of saying, I don't want to share my data. I'll only get benefits from people who are like me. Those are explicit trade-offs people can make.
As long as they're transparent.
Yeah. So I think data is a complex field, but transparency has been the big, big problem here.
Question. I would love to hear your thoughts just about telemedicine and how you see that in the next 10, 20 years, given all the gaps that are, where services are not available.
So telemedicine is very interesting. First, telemedicine today is nothing but a doctor on the phone. I almost find it trivial in terms of technology. It is valuable as a patient service because you don't have to get in front of a doctor, but it's trivial in terms of technology per se. It's literally what you do with Google Hangouts or Skype all day long, with security and a few other things. What's interesting to me is when those interactions are structured in a way where you can start inserting unusual amounts of technology, that becomes very interesting. So your cost per encounter goes down. And this is what I was sort of saying my son's attempting. You start with something similar where doctors are texting back and forth. They can look at an X-ray over text. They can look at a blood test over prescriber test. But as the AI starts doing more and more, your costs start declining. And those are the telemedicine things that would be very exciting. And what they would really do is they're structuring the conversation to capture data that they can use to help you diagnose your problem in a better and more consistent way from patient to patient. And the cost is the same no matter whether you're rich or poor, have access to medicine or not. That becomes very, very exciting. Frankly, it's the only way we'll bring access to the best medicine, the best oncologists, the best cardiologists in India, Africa, all the places. Everybody wants access but can't afford it today.
I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit away from healthcare and pick your brain about what do you see as the opportunities for these sensors to apply to personal computing and brain-computer interfaces. What do you see as the opportunities there?
Well, you heard some of the pitches from the panel just before lunch. There clearly is a lot of potential. Whether it's thinking thoughts that might need action, starting with people who may not have the ability, Stephen Hawking being a classic example. But Control talked about it. Some of the other people have talked about what can be done. I think in the end, there'll be a more metaphysical question, what is it to be human? And if you want to read about that, the guy who, Eli Harari wrote that book, Yuval Harari wrote this book, It's worth reading. Enhancement of the human form is going to happen, and the question is, what will we allow? Some of these are not technology choices, they're social choices, and every society may choose differently. Let me add another thing here that's important. Different societies will make different choices. You asked me about data. The choices in China are very, very different. What Europe has done with GDPR is probably kill progress. Almost certainly in 10 years, the Chinese companies will be way ahead of the Europeans. Europe will feel, if AI plays out as I expect it will in 20 years, Europe will feel like a developing backwards country or area. Why? Because the constraints they have put will have unintended consequences of putting them way behind in the race. It's not clear where the US is going. This is why I think transparency is very, very important. But there will be countries that won't care. They'll care about the benefits and services they can provide to the whole population. So these are explicit social choices. Every society will pick differently. They may be for social benefit, they may be for politics, they may be for economic reasons because there's companies that are influencing policy. All of those, it's messy.
So each year I've ended this conversation by asking you what you believe health and disease diagnosis and management, and I'd like to add in drug discovery if possible, will look like in 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years.
I think you referred to this thing I wrote about 3 or 4 years ago. I wrote a paper called 20% Doctor Included. The 20% was the human element of care. The other 80% was the expertise in diagnosing, in treating, in prescribing, in monitoring. And we don't really do monitoring even in the most expensive healthcare services. As I said earlier, I think the notion of symptom-based medicine will disappear. If you look at the complexity of a person's body, we've started to look at genomics. Genomics is far less powerful than transcriptomics in what's really going on, which is far less powerful than proteomics. And so if I were to sort of bet, proteomics and metabolomics will be way more powerful than transcriptomics, which will be more powerful than genomics. Genomics is sort of a steady state propensity. The dynamics of systems will matter. And I recommend a fun book called Network Medicine. It's not a term many people have heard, but you can go on Amazon. It's a guy called Barbersi at Boston U who's written this book. State of the body is like a complex system. And we will be able to predict heart disease 10, 20, 30 years before it happens. We'll be able to predict diabetes that way. And how we take this network of, say, 3,000 metabolic pathways inside our body, all communicating through the vascular system and a few other systems like the nervous system. And it's almost, I imagine someday somebody will build a model and every single thing, input will be modelable and predictable. Add to it the complexity of something like a microbiome. The microbiome transcriptome, each poop sample has a few million pieces of RNA in it. That's the reality. So if you said, what's my microbiome doing? Its transcriptome is really, really valuable. No human data, human doctor can look at all this. So you're going to see very different ways to diagnose disease. I don't think it'll be how you're feeling today. It may be a wearable, but my bet is your HRV, and somebody was talking about, Mike Snyder was talking about heart rate. Yeah, and I've 4 years ago, I speculated that when you're getting the flu, your HRV will change long before you feel the symptoms. And so that kind of diagnosis, predictive in advance, will be what will happen and will give us a much better chance at preventing cardiac disease, preventing diabetes, preventing Alzheimer's, those kinds of things. So I'm very optimistic about that. How fast, what happens in 10 or 20, I take a pass at speculating on that in my paper 3 or 4 years ago called 20% doctor included. Since there's a lot of researchers in this audience, let me say one thing. When you have this much data, you'll discover a lot of things. But it's very likely that in many cases, we won't determine causality, we'll just determine correlations. So for those of you who are graduate students or looking for PhDs, I expect when we get a lot of data and a lot of AI, the number of research opportunities will explode through the roof because there'll be many more things that need explanation. So it's good news for all of you PhDs. The need for PhD students will explode.
So I want to thank you. I mean, the reason that it's such a pleasure to do this interview with you is your love of serious and the most sophisticated science. And it's a pleasure to hear you talk.
Science, let me just say, science is the most powerful tool we have in bringing these services to humanity. And it takes that plus a few passionate people either on the research side or entrepreneurs saying, I'm going to solve this problem. And I may fail, but I'm going to try. Then you get a shot at succeeding. I always say my willingness to fail gives me a chance to succeed. Thanks for everybody.
Thank you. So you're all invited downstairs to the lower level where we had lunch for some drinks and some food. And we will begin tomorrow morning at 8:15 with breakfast. Our first talk, Anima Anand Kumar from NVIDIA and Caltech, will be at 8:45.